Good morning, evening, afternoon, or whenever you might be watching this. Welcome back to History 1877 to the present. My name is Professor Fuehrer, and we are going to be jumping right back into the middle of World War II. So, we have gone over how World War II started. We went over all of the things that kicked it off, such as the raping of Nanking, the invasion of Poland, appeasement, all of those things. What eventually brought the U.S. into the World War with Pearl Harbor, and furthermore how the war itself went. The two theaters, the European/Western theater front, whatever you want to call it, and the Pacific/Eastern theater front, whatever you want to call that as well. So we're going to pivot before we get to the next unit to go over what's going on in the U.S. itself during this time period. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into today's lecture. It is going to be lecture 6.7, and it is going to be the home front. So let's dive right in. So throughout this cartoon, you are going to see, or not throughout this cartoon, my bad, throughout this PowerPoint, we're going to be looking at a lot of political cartoons. We're going to be looking at a lot of propaganda, as in during most wartime, countries tend to produce propaganda, and the U.S. is absolutely no different. So go ahead, take a moment to pause the video, break down this political cartoon. As you can see, it is Dr. Seuss, so go ahead, take a moment to do that. As you notice, it is pointing out the fact that the U.S. isn't really doing a whole lot against Germany and Japan. It is encouraging the U.S. to do more. You see that Germany and Japan are throwing bricks at the bird. It's Dr. Seuss style. It's meant to represent Uncle Sam. You can notice by the hat, and it shows Pearl Harbor and Manila, the invasion of the U.S. colony of the Philippines at the time. It's talking about the U.S. rules for gentlemen, and the bird is thinking, if they're going to play dirty, why am I not going to play dirty? Dr. Seuss was not the only one creating World War II propaganda. Walt Disney did as well with the classic Donald Duck cartoon called Der Fuhrer's Face. I'm going to post a video link down in the description below for that cartoon. It's a lot of fun. I'm going to post some cartoon propaganda about the Japanese as well. It is pretty dated. There are some racy elements to it. I'm just going to put that out there, but I would encourage everybody to watch it because it is a part of American history. So, workforce in the home front. The U.S. is going to be, just like in World War I, involved in a total war here. This is where every part of the country is going to mobilize towards committing to the war effort. So, everybody back home is playing their part in order to make sure that the war is working. FDR is going to give out a lot of loans and tax breaks to companies who are going to aid in the war effort. So you're going to start seeing companies like Ford making engines for tanks and other companies making stuff for the battlefront. The government is going to force civilian industries, these companies that are usually meant for consumer goods, to produce for the war effort. A bunch of jobs are going to pop up over on the West Coast as well in California. Large part of the reason is the bad guys that we are more worried about here in the U.S. is really going to be more so Japan. Because of that, military manufacturing is going to take place on the West Coast because that's the coast that's closer to Japan. It's going to be closer to the Pacific front. And as you guys already saw in the previous two PowerPoint slides, there is plenty of wartime propaganda that is going to be created during this time. This is a very, very classic one. During the war effort, nearly all of the men are going to be off fighting in the war. They're going to be off at World War II. They're going to be fighting in Europe. They're going to be fighting in the Pacific. And that is going to leave a lot of the factory jobs back home to the women. This is where you get this super duper feminist icon, Rosie the Riveter, saying we can do it. It's going to be wartime propaganda encouraging women to go into the workforce, encouraging them to work in factories to help support the war effort as well. This is the first time on a really large scale you're starting to see women in the workforce in U.S. history, at least on this level of scale. So, speaking of women in the workforce, during the war, women are going to fill the roles left behind by men. By 1943, women are going to make up 1/3 of the civilian labor force. They're going to open up a lot more opportunities for married women and mothers, especially during this time. You do have non-married women before this working in the workforce, but now it's going to be open to all women. Many at this time as well, they're going to view this as a temporary necessity. This isn't necessarily an outright change in culture. While this is going to push for more cultural change in feminism in the late 50s and in the 60s, it's really more so going to be a wartime necessity. However, women do get this taste of freedom in World War II at the home front, and it's going to lead to more pushes for equal opportunities for women in the workplace. However, the expectation of the government and of culture at large is after the war, the women are going to return home to the realm of domesticity, basically being mothers, housekeepers, housewives. So, speaking of other marginalized groups, you also have the Double V-Campain. This is going to be a big African American push during World War II. You're going to have over 1 million African Americans serving in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II. And out of this, the civil rights movement is going to be born. I would argue that World War II is really one of the largest contributors to the civil rights movement getting kicked off in the 50s. So, the Double V-Campaign, what does Double V stand for? It stands for double victory. Victory abroad and victory at home. Obviously, the enemy of African Americans, both abroad and at home, is going to be racists. Abroad, that is obviously going to be the Nazis, and victory at home is going to indicate victory over white supremacy and Jim Crow down in the South. The supporters of the U.S. war effort are also going to push for improvements in race relations back home. And it's really going to force a lot of whites to confront the fact, hey, these African American men are willing to give their lives and die for this country. People such as the Tuskegee Airmen are willing to fight and die for this country. So if they're willing to do that, if they're willing to put their lives on the line for this country, how can we be treating them like second-class citizens? You also start to see the rise of a larger black coalition internationally as well. So not all minority groups are getting it that great. Japanese Americans are going to have it pretty rough here in the United States. So let's talk about that very briefly. Executive Order 9066 is going to be passed by FDR. Executive Order 9066, you really do need to know that. What it basically is going to do is it's going to label pretty much all Japanese Americans and Japanese in the United States as foreign enemies, as potential foreign enemies. In particular, it's going to target Japanese Americans and Japanese people living on the West Coast. Large part of the reason is because this is where most of the military activity is happening, and there is a very, very large fear that these Japanese Americans aren't really loyal to the American half, they're more loyal to the Japanese half. The issue with this is majority of these people going into these detention camps are going to be full-blown American citizens. Some of these people, their families have lived here for multiple generations, and they're extremely Americanized. So people are going to be pulled from their lives on the West Coast, and they're going to be moved towards the interior of the country, more towards, say, like where Colorado is today. The U.S. government is worried about the loyalty of these Japanese Americans, and again, their population centers, unfortunately, are right next to a lot of major ports and military bases. So if there are any spies among them, they're 100% going to have access to these things. They're also worried in the case of an invasion. Obviously, if Japan's going to invade the U.S., they're not going to invade on the East Coast. They're not going to invade like Boston or New York. They're going to invade on the West Coast. It's going to be San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle. So because of that, they're going to move them away from the coast in case if there ever is a Japanese invasion. This is all going to come to a head in the U.S. Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American, is going to sue, saying that this is illegal under the Constitution. You are denying us our right to a trial before jury. You're throwing us in what is essentially jail before having any type of trial. You've considered us guilty without any type of fair trial. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule 6-3 in favor of the federal government here, saying that this is completely and totally justified. And just like the German Americans in World War II, they're going to, or not World War II, World War I, the Japanese Americans are going to be put in detention camps as well. They are also going to target a lot of permanent residents who are of German and Italian descent as well, but the primary target and the group that gets most affected is Japanese Americans. And you can see right here, these are the detention camps. I do want to make very clear these aren't concentration camps. They're not putting these people here to kill them. They're not putting these people here to torture them to death like the Germans were. However, they don't have any say on whether or not they come or they go. They are required to be here. This isn't the Holocaust, but it's also not great. It's really, really terrible. And you can see more political propaganda here. We got more Dr. Seuss propaganda. Go ahead, pause the video, and go ahead and break it down for yourselves. Looking at this political cartoon, we can see that we are on the West Coast. We see Washington, Oregon, and California, and we see a bunch of Japanese Americans. If you notice, all of them are going ahead. They're getting TNT, and it says waiting for the signal from home. This cartoon by Dr. Seuss is indicating that he believes, as many Americans did at the time, that the Japanese Americans would not be loyal to the United States. They were more loyal to Japan than they were to their home country of the United States. So, this is all going to lead us to the Manhattan Project. We talked about the consequences of the Manhattan Project in the previous lecture with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The federal government is going to start this program in secret. Virtually nobody knows about it. It's all going to kick off with Albert Einstein, who had fled Europe at the time. He comes to the United States and he warns FDR. He's like, look, the Nazis are creating a super weapon. They are creating an atomic bomb. Also, according to our modern understanding of physics back in the 1930s, Albert Einstein says this is a plausible weapon. We could create this. So the U.S. actually isn't going to create the atomic bomb to fight the Japanese. They originally created it to fight the Germans. The thing is, though, is before Germany can finish the project, they're beaten by the Allied forces. The Manhattan Project does kick off, and it's going to take place in Los Alamos, New Mexico. A group of physicists are going to be sworn to secrecy. They and their families are going to move out to Los Alamos, basically making sure that they at least have some quality of life while they're serving the U.S. military there. Basically, whenever you get there, you're not allowed to leave. All of your mail is screened and looked at. The biggest reason is they don't want any foreign enemies finding out about this whole project. They don't want Japan figuring out that the U.S. is creating an atomic bomb. And remember, this project is so secretive that the Vice President of the United States doesn't even know it exists. I believe I mentioned that in the previous lesson. Harry Truman isn't told about it until after FDR dies and he becomes president. The bombs are going to be tested out in the desert. I'd encourage you, well, maybe not the most historically accurate movie. It is a very good movie about the creation of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer came out a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago at the time of recording this. Robert Oppenheimer is going to be the lead scientist on the project. When talking about the project itself, he's going to quote, I believe it's a Indian, when I say Indian, I mean like Indian religious text saying, "Now I've become death, now I've become the destroyer of worlds," referring to his accountability, his part to play in this project. I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to post footage of that down below as well. I'd encourage you to watch that as well. It really goes to show he recognizes the gravity of what he had done. And here we see the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb, first time in world history on July 16th, 1945. This moment is going to change the world forever, and it's really going to color a lot of policy moving forward into the Cold War, and continues to be a looming threat to this day. And we are going to end off talking about the president who's going to close out World War II and bring us into the Cold War. We are going to start talking about the Cold War in Unit 7. However, This is the closeout of Unit 6. I think it's important to mention Truman, especially considering he's the one who decides to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So he had been FDR's VP during his 4th term. Remember, FDRs are only U.S. presidents to earn more than 2 terms. He serves out 3 of them, and he dies very early on in the beginning of his 4th term. Truman is a Democrat. He's going to be the president who calls for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He decides that the potential loss of life for not only American soldiers but also Japanese civilians is outweighed by the cost of dropping the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He's going to oversee the earliest parts of the Cold War as the U.S. comes out of World War II. Really left in the rubble, there's only 2 countries left standing. There's only 2 superpowers left standing, and that's going to be the U.S. and the USSR, and that's going to kick off the start of the Cold War. A war where neither country wants to start shooting at each other, because if they do, it is World War III. He's going to oversee the Korean War as well as other major projects such as the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift, which we are going to talk about in Lecture 7.1. And due to their efforts in World War II, this is one of the better things that Truman does. He is going to pass Executive Order 9980 and 9981. They are going to desegregate the U.S. military and, respectively, base admissions solely on merit. It's not going to be white guys are more likely to get the job. Now African Americans are just as likely to get the job based on merit. So that is going to lead us to the closeout of World War II and the home front. You can really see that World War II, it's not just something that's happening across the ocean. It's something that's happening right here in the United States for Americans at that time. And it kind of leads us to think about, how does what happens internationally, how do our involvements in our conflicts internationally continue to affect us to this day? We very much live in the shadow of World War II. The world has been riding a high and a peace that it has never seen before in world history since World War II. It's not to say that we have don't have a lot of problems. We do have plenty of problems, but problems that we've had historically just haven't been the case over these last 80 years. World War II is going to shape the world moving forward, and everybody is going to be terrified to get into this level of a conflict before, especially with major world powers that have developed weapons and arsenals more powerful than the world has ever seen. Gone are the days of horses and bow and arrows, or regiments with muskets using old war tactics. We are now full-blown in the modern world, and we're going to constantly be living in the consequences of that. If you have any questions and you're one of my students, please go ahead, write them down, bring them to class next time. I see you guys. And if you're not, go ahead and leave any questions you have down in the comments. I will do the best of my ability to answer those. As always, a like is appreciated. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to subscribe. If not, no worries, no skin off of my back. And as always, have an excellent day, and Ferrero out.